Public humiliation has long been used as a weapon, not just to punish but to erase. It strips away not only clothing, dignity, or safety, but the idea that a person is still a person. In conflict zones and under oppressive regimes, it becomes a language of domination, a way to say, "You belong to us now." For the perpetrators, it's about power made visible. For the victim, it's a performance of degradation that demands participation. The victim becomes unwilling theater, forced to stand in a scene written by those who hold the guns. When a woman is made to undress in public, it's not about her body, it's about her will. The act is designed to fracture her identity, to tell her that her autonomy can be rewritten at any moment. Humiliation becomes a form of control that reaches beyond the individual. The crowd that watches learns a lesson. This is what happens when someone stands against authority. The message is clear, brutal, and effective. Shame becomes the currency of obedience. Fear becomes the thread that ties a community to silence. Throughout history, such acts have been used to break spirits and enforce submission. From occupied territories to prison camps, the ritual of exposure is meant to erase the line between private and public, between human and object. It is both punishment and warning. It forces the body into a spectacle of compliance while erasing the person within it. The onlookers, caught between pity and terror, absorb the intended message. That power can unmake anyone, anytime. But humiliation doesn't always achieve what it sets out to do. Sometimes, in its cruelty, it exposes the fragility of power itself. When domination becomes that desperate, that performative, it reveals how dependent power is on being seen, on being believed. The soldiers who order the act are not only demonstrating strength, they're confessing their fear of losing control. Their violence is an act of insecurity, not confidence. They must make someone small to feel large again. In moments like these, public humiliation becomes a mirror that reflects the oppressor's weakness. It shows that their authority relies on constant performance, that without fear, their power evaporates. Every forced act, every shout, every threat is a reminder that they need witnesses to validate their strength. Without an audience, their cruelty loses its meaning. The victim, in a paradoxical way, becomes the one who holds the narrative together. Even stripped of agency, they're the center of the event, the proof that the oppressor must display his dominance to remain relevant. There is another layer to this violence, the social complicity that sustains it. The crowd's silence, the turning away, the muttered prayers, all become part of the machinery. When humiliation happens in public, it's not just about the victim and the aggressor. It's about the entire society that allows it to happen. Each witness becomes a participant, willingly or not. The fear of speaking up becomes a form of consent, and silence becomes a survival strategy. Over time, that silence hardens into culture. And yet, even under such crushing control, something human resists. The very act of enduring humiliation can plant the seed of defiance. It may not show in that moment, the trembling, the tears, the stillness, but beneath the surface, something shifts. The victim begins to see the absurdity of the aggressor's need for dominance. They realize that the oppressor's power depends on their reaction, their fear. When they stop giving it, even silently, the balance starts to tilt. Public humiliation is supposed to erase identity, but it often does the opposite. It forces the victim to confront who they are in the rawest sense. Stripped of social armor, of the protections of status, clothing, or community, what remains is the self that refuses to disappear. That self is not defined by what is taken away, but by what survives the taking. In that survival lies quiet rebellion. The psychological intent of humiliation is to turn a person into an object. But objects do not remember, and people do. They carry the story, the scar, the memory, and memory is a weapon that power cannot easily control. When witnesses remember, when stories are told, humiliation loses its permanence. It becomes a record of cruelty instead of a display of strength. The victim becomes a symbol, not of shame, but of what power tried and failed to destroy. Public humiliation as a weapon of control may bend the human spirit, but it never fully breaks it. It's an act that seeks to define someone from the outside, but identity, real identity, is something no one else can write. The oppressor can strip away everything visible, but they cannot reach the quiet, stubborn core that refuses to be rewritten. That's where defiance begins, not in words or rebellion, but in the unspoken knowledge that the humiliation says more about the perpetrator's fear than the victim's worth. The cipher on her waist wasn't decoration. It was a mark that meant something, a shape that carried weight beyond what the soldiers could understand. At first glance, it looked like an intricate tattoo, lines, symbols, perhaps a remnant of ritual or faith. But to those who knew its language, it was a boundary, a declaration of identity. It wasn't meant to be seen by the men who tore at her clothes. It was meant to be remembered by those who had given it to her, a sign of belonging that couldn't be erased by fear. The moment it was revealed, everything shifted. The air around them changed. The commander's confidence wavered. The symbol meant something to him, or to someone above him. He hesitated, his hand still raised, his face caught between recognition and disbelief. The cipher had turned a powerless moment into one charged with unseen authority. It carried the weight of a secret order, a connection to something larger than the scene unfolding in the dirt. The soldiers looked to him for direction, but he said nothing. What had begun as a performance of humiliation became a moment of confusion, then respect, then unease. Symbols have always had power because they reach where words cannot. They compress stories, faiths, loyalties, and histories into a single visible form. In this case, the cipher was not just an image. It was a code of belonging, a piece of history carved into skin. It spoke of lineage, of knowledge guarded through generations, of something sacred enough to be marked permanently on the body. The woman who bore it knew what it meant. She knew the risk of carrying it, of exposing it. But in that instant, when her oppressors forced her to undress, the mark that was supposed to shame her became her defense. The soldiers couldn't name their fear, but they felt it. Power built on intimidation collapses when faced with something it doesn't understand. The cipher represented mystery, and mystery unnerves those who depend on control. To dominate someone, you must believe you know them, their limits, their weaknesses, their story. The mark broke that illusion. It told them there was a story they didn't know, a depth beyond their grasp. The woman stopped being a victim and became a question, and questions are dangerous to those who rely on certainty. Throughout history, symbols like this have defied conquest. Invaders burned flags, destroyed temples, banned languages, yet the marks on skin, the whispered words, the hidden gestures survived. The cipher was part of that legacy. It was a private code turned public revelation, a reminder that identity could be encoded deeper than clothing or circumstance. No act of violence could translate or erase it. The commander, in that frozen moment, understood he had crossed into territory he couldn't control, spiritual, cultural, perhaps even political. The cipher was a sign that this woman wasn't just an individual. She was connected to something bigger, something with power equal to or greater than his own. The psychology of symbols works both ways. For the woman, the cipher was armor. It reminded her of who she was, even when everything else was being stripped away. It was proof that she belonged to a story larger than her fear. For the commander, it was a threat, a reminder that he, too, was part of a structure that could crumble under the weight of something he didn't understand. The symbol destabilized him because it spoke to power that didn't depend on guns or uniforms. It was the kind of power that survives in whispers, in faith, in bloodlines. The cipher's meaning didn't need to be explained. Its strength came from ambiguity. Everyone who saw it felt something, even if they didn't know why. It became a mirror, reflecting back each person's beliefs and fears. To some, it might have looked like rebellion. To others, protection. To the commander, it was a reminder of forces beyond his reach. It shifted the balance of the scene without a single word. That's the power of symbols. They don't argue. They declare. In that moment, silence became her weapon. The cipher spoke for her. The soldiers who had been laughing a moment before now stood uncertain. Their power depended on her submission, but she no longer seemed afraid. The mark gave her an authority they couldn't define. Even if they resumed their cruelty, they could never return to the confidence they had before. Something had been broken in them, the certainty that they were untouchable. The cipher had reminded them of limits, of a larger world in which they might be the ones judged. The story of the cipher is about how meaning hides in plain sight. A mark on the body, a pattern, a word. These can become lifelines in moments of despair. They carry memory across generations, turning the personal into the collective. The woman's cipher wasn't a coincidence. It was a continuation of a long, invisible tradition of resistance encoded in flesh. Where weapons fail, symbols endure. They move through time quietly, waiting for the moment they are needed. The cipher on her waist wasn't magic. It was history written in code, memory etched in skin, power that could not be stripped away. The soldiers thought they could unmake her by undressing her, but they uncovered the one thing that proved she could never truly be undone. Power is fragile when it depends on fear. The moment fear slips, even slightly, the illusion of control begins to fracture. When the cipher on her waist stopped the commander cold, it wasn't just about a symbol. It was about the sudden realization that power can be interrupted by the unknown. The woman standing before them had been reduced, humiliated, turned into an object of command. Yet in one instant, without raising a voice or a hand, she shifted the balance. The unit, trained to obey orders without question, found itself paralyzed by doubt. The authority that had filled the space moments earlier started to leak out, invisible but undeniable. The power shift in that scene wasn't loud. It didn't come through confrontation or resistance. It came through hesitation, the brief silence that follows recognition. The commander saw something he couldn't explain, something that spoke to forces beyond the chain of command. In that pause, the hierarchy of dominance cracked. The soldiers looked at him for direction, and when he didn't move, they saw his fear. Fear is contagious. What began as control dissolved into confusion, because power only feels absolute until someone or something challenges its foundation. The cipher had done that without intent, simply by existing where it wasn't supposed to. The dynamics of control depend on predictability. When the oppressed behave as expected, when they cry, beg, or remain silent, the oppressor's authority stays intact. Every response fits the script. But when something happens outside that script, power falters. The cipher broke the rhythm of domination. The soldiers expected submission. Instead, they got mystery. And mystery forces imagination, which is dangerous for those who rule through force. The mind begins to fill the gap with possibilities, superstition, politics, fate, punishment. Anything unknown becomes potentially powerful, and fear thrives on that uncertainty. The shift was visible in body language. The commander's stance softened. The mocking smirks of his men faded. The energy that had been feeding their cruelty now turned inward. The woman didn't have to move. She simply existed differently now. They had seen something that redefined her in their eyes. She was no longer a nameless captive, but a carrier of meaning. That realization reversed the current of fear. The soldiers began to feel what they had forced others to feel. The trembling uncertainty of being at the mercy of something larger than themselves. Moments like this reveal the truth about power. It's a performance. It relies on constant reaffirmation, on an audience that accepts the roles. The soldiers needed to believe in their dominance as much as the woman was supposed to believe in her helplessness. When the cipher appeared, it tore through that fiction. The commander was no longer sure of his role. The soldiers were no longer sure of his authority, and the woman, though still physically powerless, held the center of the stage. The act of domination had turned into a spectacle of confusion. The unknown always disturbs power because it exposes its limits. Every regime, every army, every hierarchy survives by pretending it understands everything. Uncertainty threatens that image. The cipher represented knowledge that existed outside their control, a language, a history, maybe even a secret allegiance. It didn't matter what it truly meant. What mattered was that they didn't know. Ignorance, in the presence of fear, breeds reverence. The same men who had shouted orders now whispered, glancing at the symbol as though it might speak. Their laughter died because laughter requires confidence, and confidence had left them. Power that depends on violence is always aware of its own instability. That's why it demands constant reinforcement. Every act of cruelty is a reminder to the self. I am still in charge. But the cipher introduced something violence couldn't touch. It carried meaning that bullets and commands couldn't erase. The commander realized that the rules he enforced didn't apply to whatever force this mark represented. He had spent his career mastering control, but control ends where comprehension does. The cipher was the edge of his map, the point beyond which his authority meant nothing. For the woman, that moment wasn't victory in the traditional sense. She hadn't planned it, hadn't fought back in any visible way. Yet the power dynamic had flipped. Her silence became presence. Her stillness became command. The men who had undressed her were now metaphorically exposed themselves, stripped of certainty, stripped of control. The crowd, once complicit through silence, began to sense the shift as well. The scene that began as an act of humiliation turned into a ritual of reversal. The one who was supposed to be powerless became the center of gravity, and those who were supposed to dominate were drawn into her orbit of mystery and fear. Power often collapses not from rebellion, but from recognition. When the oppressed stop fearing the oppressor, or when the oppressor starts fearing what the oppressed represent, the entire structure trembles. The cipher made visible that fear. It wasn't just a mark on her body. It was a mirror reflecting the limits of force. The soldiers could command her body, but they couldn't command what she stood for. They couldn't interpret her mark, and that ignorance turned their confidence into doubt. The woman, once seen as an object, now existed beyond their reach, untouchable in a way they couldn't articulate. The moment the commander stepped back, everyone saw it. It wasn't a retreat in distance, but a retreat in certainty. The balance of fear had shifted direction. The cipher had reminded them that no power is absolute, that authority built on intimidation is always one unknown away from collapse. Identity is the last thing they can't take. When everything else is stripped away, clothing, name, voice, dignity, identity remains, invisible but unyielding. It exists beneath humiliation, beneath fear, beneath the rules written by those in power. In that square, when they made her undress, they thought they were unmaking her. They believed that by exposing her body, they were erasing herself. But identity is not written on the surface. It lives in the way someone holds their silence, in the way their eyes refuse to break. It is an armor no one else can see, but everyone feels when it refuses to bend. For those who wield control through shame, identity is the enemy. The whole system of domination depends on the victim accepting the version of themselves imposed by force. You are no longer a person, you are a warning. You are not an individual, you are an example. But this only works when the victim believes it. The moment someone refuses that definition, even silently, the entire mechanism falters. Because power needs agreement to function, it needs you to play the role it has written. She didn't. Even as they stripped her, she didn't surrender the core of who she was. That refusal became her armor. Identity in such moments isn't loud or dramatic. It doesn't shout slogans or raise fists. It stands still. It breathes. It waits. It watches the aggressor and does not disappear. The soldiers could touch her body, but they couldn't touch what the cipher meant to her. The mark on her waist wasn't just a pattern. It was a declaration of selfhood that predated this humiliation. It reminded her that she came from something, belonged to something, carried something older and stronger than the cruelty of men with guns. Her identity wasn't constructed by them. It was remembered despite them. In the logic of oppression, control is about narrative. The oppressor decides what the story means. They define who is victim, who is villain, who is weak. Public humiliation serves that narrative. It's a performance meant to teach others who holds the script. But when the victim holds a story of their own, one that cannot be rewritten, the performance collapses. The cipher on her waist wasn't just ink or ritual. It was her reminder that she carried her own script, one no one else could read. That knowledge turned her silence into defiance, her stillness into strength. Every society that has faced conquest understands this kind of power. When culture, language, and religion are outlawed, identity retreats underground. It hides in gestures, in songs, in symbols, in skin. It becomes a secret inheritance, something parents pass down in whispers. When exposed to violence, it doesn't vanish, it transforms. It becomes armor. The woman in that square was not simply naked. She was wrapped in memory. She was standing inside a lineage that no amount of humiliation could erase. The cipher was a visible reminder, but the real protection came from the meaning behind it, the awareness of belonging to a history larger than any army. The soldiers saw a body. She carried a nation. They saw vulnerability. She embodied endurance. That's the paradox of identity. It is both invisible and indestructible. The commander could command obedience, but he couldn't command belief. He could threaten, but he couldn't reach the part of her that refused to believe she was powerless. Her identity was not negotiable, and that made her untouchable in a way he couldn't explain. He could not destroy what he could not define. Identity as armor doesn't mean the absence of fear. She felt fear, shame, the weight of eyes watching. But armor doesn't remove pain. It absorbs it. It allows survival. Her fear didn't erase her sense of self. It confirmed it. Each breath she took under their gaze became proof that they hadn't succeeded in turning her into an object. She remained someone who could still feel, still think, still know who she was. That was enough to hold her together when everything else was being taken apart. The cipher on her waist became more than a mark. It became the visible edge of her inner life. It connected what was happening in that moment to something timeless. Her body was the battlefield, but her identity was the fortress. The commander saw the mark and hesitated, but what truly stopped him wasn't the symbol. It was the realization that she still possessed something beyond his reach. He was staring at a kind of strength he couldn't quantify, a form of power that didn't depend on status or weaponry. Every system of oppression fears that kind of resilience. It fears what cannot be seen, what cannot be measured, what cannot be killed. The soldiers could control her actions, but not her meaning. They could expose her body, but not her truth. Identity held her upright when humiliation was meant to make her collapse. It reminded her that she was not defined by this single moment, that she existed beyond it. The cipher on her waist didn't grant her protection from violence, but it gave her protection from erasure. Identity as armor isn't about pride or defiance in the traditional sense. It's about endurance. It's about carrying something unbreakable through spaces built to break people. It's the quiet, stubborn persistence of self that keeps breathing when the world demands silence. That's the kind of armor that doesn't shine or clang. It simply endures, unseen but unyielding, proof that even silence has its own language. In the square where the soldiers stood, it filled the air heavier than their commands. The crowd watched, eyes lowered, mouths shut, bodies stiff with the instinct to stay invisible. Silence became a shield and a sentence. Each person in that crowd knew that speaking up meant disappearing next. The woman in the center stood alone, the object of their forced attention, but the silence surrounding her was a kind of wall, a wall built out of fear, self-preservation, and the unspoken understanding that this was how power worked. Collective silence doesn't come from indifference. It comes from terror so deep it rearranges the moral code. People tell themselves that survival is the same as neutrality, that silence is not participation. But in truth, silence is part of the system. It gives cruelty space to operate. It creates the illusion that what's happening is inevitable. Every soldier learns this instinct early. If the crowd stays quiet, the act is justified. No one's protest means consent. No one's voice means permission. The moment the first order was shouted, the crowd had already been conquered long before the woman was. The woman's defiance, however, existed within that same silence. She had no army, no allies in the crowd, no one willing to step forward. But her stillness, the refusal to cry or plead, began to alter the texture of the silence itself. What was once passive started to feel charged. People watching began to sense that their silence no longer protected them from shame, it bound them to it. The woman's composure, her unbroken gaze, reflected back their own inaction. She was the mirror they couldn't look away from. Silence is not empty. It's full of everything people are too afraid to say. Beneath it lies guilt, grief, confusion, loyalty, and the ache of powerlessness. The soldiers thrived on that silence because it created an echo chamber for their authority. No one questioned, no one resisted, no one humanized the victim. But when the cipher appeared, that silence shifted again. The commander's hesitation rippled outward, breaking the spell. The same crowd that had been frozen in fear now saw uncertainty on the faces of those in control. And when power hesitates, silence starts to sound different. Collective silence is never neutral. It either sustains power or dismantles it. In that instant of pause, the crowd's fear began to mix with curiosity, with the faint possibility that what they were witnessing might not end the way they expected. Someone coughed. Someone whispered. Tiny cracks appeared in the stillness. The soldiers noticed. The woman noticed. And even though no one spoke loudly, the change was there. The collective understanding that something sacred had intruded on the machinery of control. The cipher had given the silence a new meaning. It was no longer just the sound of submission. It was the sound of tension before change. Defiance can exist in many forms. Sometimes it's a shout, a protest, a fight. Sometimes it's the decision not to look away. The woman's defiance existed in how she refused to vanish under the weight of humiliation. Her stillness wasn't surrender, it was endurance. It was the choice to remain herself even when stripped of everything external. The soldiers wanted a reaction, tears, begging, anything that reaffirmed their superiority. Instead, they got quiet resistance, and that quiet unnerved them more than any scream could. Silence turned into her weapon. The same tool the oppressors had used to dominate the crowd now turned back on them. The collective silence of the witnesses began to blur into something more complicated. Some still looked down, trying to pretend nothing was happening. Others looked at her differently, as though realizing for the first time that humiliation could be survived. That survival, that simple act of not breaking, carried more power than any rebellion they'd seen. The commander, sensing the shift, understood that control was slipping, not through disobedience, but through awareness. Once people begin to see, the silence stops being safe for those in power. Throughout history, silence has both protected and destroyed. It shields people from immediate danger, but it also builds a world where danger multiplies unchecked. The woman's defiance cracked that cycle. The mark on her waist, the calm in her eyes, the way the soldiers stepped back. These things transformed the meaning of that shared quiet. What had started as fear became witness. What had been passive became loaded with memory. The crowd didn't cheer or speak, but they watched differently. That alone was enough to shift the story from one of domination to one of awakening. Defiance in silence isn't about noise, it's about presence. It's the act of being unbroken in front of those who expect collapse. It forces the oppressors to see themselves reflected in what they've created. The soldiers, seeing her unshaken, began to feel their own brutality echo back at them. The crowd, sensing her steadiness, began to feel the weight of their own stillness. For the first time, silence no longer served power, it served awareness. And awareness, once born, cannot be silenced again. The woman's defiance turned the square into a different kind of battlefield. No one moved, no one shouted, yet everything had changed. The collective silence that had once belonged to fear now belonged to truth. It lingered like smoke, impossible to contain, whispering the one thing no authority can endure. The realization that even under absolute control, a single act of quiet resistance can make everyone see what power tries hardest to hide. The mark on her waist wasn't meant to be seen, but once it was, everything changed. What began as an act of humiliation became the start of transformation. The soldiers had intended to strip her of dignity, to turn her body into proof of their dominance. But the moment the cipher appeared, the meaning of the scene reversed. The mark that was supposed to deepen her shame became a source of power. It was no longer about what they did to her, but about what they accidentally revealed, a symbol that redefined her in the eyes of everyone watching. Shame has always been used as a weapon. It isolates, it crushes, it makes the victim believe they are smaller than the pain inflicted upon them. It's designed to erase identity and replace it with submission. But shame only works when it is accepted. The moment the cipher was exposed, the power dynamic shifted because she no longer carried shame alone. The crowd saw something sacred, something forbidden, something that did not belong to the language of humiliation. The commander saw it too and froze, recognizing a meaning he could neither control nor desecrate. The symbol that was supposed to expose her instead exposed the limits of his authority. The transformation of shame into power happens in silence, in the split second when humiliation loses its certainty. It's not defiance in the loud sense, it's revelation. The woman did not fight back. She simply existed as herself, with the mark that told a story older than her fear. It was as if the past had stepped into the square to stand with her. The cipher carried memory, and memory resists domination. It reminded everyone watching that history cannot be rewritten through violence, that some stories persist even when buried beneath cruelty. The commander's hesitation was more than confusion, it was recognition. The mark represented something forbidden, perhaps a lineage, a secret order, a faith long suppressed. To him, it wasn't just an image. It was a reminder that no matter how total his control seemed, there were still codes of meaning he couldn't touch. He had power over the present moment, but not over the memory it contained. The cipher was a wound in his certainty, a sign that the world he ruled wasn't as absolute as he wanted it to be. For the woman, that same symbol became protection. She had carried it quietly, never imagining it would save her. But in that moment, it did. It turned the gaze of the soldiers away from mockery and toward awe. The act of humiliation lost its rhythm. Their cruelty depended on her vulnerability, but now they saw something untouchable. She stood in front of them, stripped and exposed, yet somehow they were the ones revealed. The mark inverted the direction of shame. It no longer clung to her, it clung to them. They had become the ones who didn't understand, who feared what they couldn't name. The crowd, once silent witnesses, began to feel the shift as well. What they saw wasn't just survival, it was transformation. The woman who had been powerless a moment ago now embodied something sacred. The air thickened with realization. No one spoke, but everyone felt it. The energy changing, the balance moving. Humiliation had failed. What had been meant to destroy her spirit had instead reminded everyone of what could not be destroyed. Power often hides behind violence, but it is most threatened by symbols that don't break. The cipher represented endurance, meaning preserved through secrecy, knowledge kept alive when everything else was taken away. By carrying it, the woman became a vessel of resistance older than the soldiers themselves. Her body, meant to be a stage for degradation, became a living altar. The soldiers, unable to continue their act, found themselves standing before something sacred instead of something weak. The shame they had tried to impose bounced back at them, showing the emptiness of their authority. Transformation doesn't erase pain, it reclaims it. The humiliation she endured didn't vanish, it became evidence. The cipher turned it into testimony, proof that power cannot fully erase what it tries to humiliate. Her suffering became a story not of defeat, but of reversal. The image of her standing there, marked and unbroken, would remain in memory long after the soldiers left. The symbol had made her unforgettable, and in that, she had won a victory that existed beyond survival. The mark that turned shame into power wasn't magic, it was meaning. Meaning is what fear can't conquer. Meaning is what remains when language fails, when violence exhausts itself, when silence becomes unbearable. The cipher was her proof that no humiliation is final if it reveals the truth hidden beneath it. The commander, once certain of his authority, saw in her what he could never possess. The strength that comes from knowing who you are even when the world tries to unmake you. The transformation of shame into power isn't about triumph. It's about endurance turned inside out. It's the moment when the thing meant to destroy you becomes the thing that defines you. The cipher was the crack in the weapon of humiliation, the flaw in the machinery of control. Through it, shame lost its grip, and power found a new shape, quiet, immovable, written not in domination but in remembrance. In that square, surrounded by silence and fear, she had become more than a victim. She had become the symbol of everything power could never truly defeat.